Welcome once again to Inside the War Room. Ryan right here as always. Today's guest is a man that I've known for probably 4 or 5 years now. Always been gracious with his time, always has great insight. I'm talking about David Blackmon, who is the editor of Shell Mag, Shell Magazine. ShellMag.com is the website. He's a Forbes contributor. He also has In the Patch Radio. We talk about all that in the show. In today's show, we talk about what's going on in Iran. We talk about Venezuela, Africa, U.S. oil industry, the ERCOT freeze out, everything that you'd want to hear. Stay to the end. New segment for the show, which is Ryan's recommendations. Without further ado, here's David Blackmon. Well, David, I think you have made an appearance on almost all of my shows now. You got the cycle working.
You've got a lot of them going on, man. It's great.
Well, I try to get the conversation going from different perspectives. Texas Oil Gas Podcast or Energy Week or now this one, and this one kind of is more of a more general, allows us to talk about more general things. What I found is that some people will love you on one topic, but they don't want to hear you on something else. So hopefully this they can hear about everything here. And so it's a little bit more broad based, but it's good to have you on once again. A lot to get into.
Always enjoy it, man. Always enjoy our conversations.
Well, one of the things that, and I think I said this on here, but if not, I'll say it again. You have always been so kind with your time. Going back to the Global Energy podcast days. I was looking back at some of those podcasts the other day, and remember we had that round table we did with you and Jackie and oh gosh, I can see the guy can't name his name, but for the first 100 days of Trump. Anyway, so you've always been a helpful person, and so always appreciate you. Have your finger on the oil and gas pulse, and that's one of the things.
By the way, that roundtable we did in January with David Ramsden Wood and oh my gosh,
and Ellen.
Yeah. I mean, I think we pretty much all got it right on oil prices, didn't we? Back then when all the quote experts were predicting we're going to be in $30-$40 oil prices for the rest of the year, and we all said, yeah, that's nonsense.
Right.
So anyway,
it's funny. I'll link to that in the show notes for people to go check it out. But I was thinking, we should probably maybe do another one of those again, maybe in October, kind of like a post, kind of a follow up from last year, because I got a lot of good feedback on that. That was a great event. I enjoyed doing that. Okay.
Yeah, it was fun.
So let's start with, we both live here in Texas. We're as far as Texas time goes, we're basically neighbors, but I think we're about an hour apart. For Texas, that's like next.
That's around the corner.
And so we have been dealing with not the impact of the ERCOT failure back in February. It's funny, it's not just the power outage. The whole state is dealing with it from different ramifications. I went fishing down in Corpus 2 weeks ago, I guess it was, and they were talking about just how the fishing hasn't really adjusted. It has nothing to do with the power. It's just the freeze has messed up so much.
The fish patterns and
stuff like that. So it's just funny. We're still dealing with that in other areas.
Yeah.
And you, I don't know if you've heard about this or not, but there's a group online that kind of makes parody swag that kind of mocks oil and gas or energy. They're pro oil and gas, but they just kind of take shots at it. And they made a swag called BRCOT, BRRCOT. And well, ERCOT sent them a cease and desist letter over it.
You're kidding?
No, we just had them on Texas Oil Gas Podcast on Monday for two things: one, for saying the word BRCOT, and two, for the logo. The logo I can maybe understand, but you can't say I can't say BRCOT. And if you don't say BRCOT, don't let people freeze to death, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, do your damn jobs, and people won't make fun of you.
So where are we at? What have we learned? Have they learned anything? I know we've learned a lot. So kind of break down what's going on as we sit here at the end of June 2021.
Well, what we learned in February and had learned again in April on the 13th and 14th when ERCOT had to send out capacity warnings. And again, what was that? The second week in June when they had to do the same thing again. What we learned is several things. First, the power plants and a lot of the pipeline and oil field infrastructure needs to be winterized. And the wind turbines too. Although, of course, the wind people say, well, you can't expect wind to perform when it's cold or when it's hot. I just saw another wind expert the other day on a Bloomberg piece saying, well, when it gets real hot, we don't expect the wind to perform anyway. So when we really need it, wind's not there. But none of those are winterized in the state. We have a definite lack of reserve capacity on the grid. There's no question about it. Yet people still continue to try to argue that point, which is crazy. And ERCOT constantly, their computer models consistently, they're like climate change models, which consistently overestimate the temperature rise. ERCOT's computer models consistently overestimate how much they can expect to get out of wind power on any given day. And so when you look at those days in April and again in June, when we had lack of capacity warnings and, asking people to conserve energy from ERCOT, on all those days, they had estimated they're going to get 10 to 12 megawatts out of the wind industry in the state. And instead they got 3.5, right? Because the wind stopped blowing. And they did it during February too. I mean, you can just look at the charts ERCOT published. They consistently overestimated how much they were going to get out of wind on those days. And, ultimately at one point, wind was generating about 3% of its capacity. And yet everyone in the news media points fingers at natural gas, which had lost at one point about 35% of its capacity offline. And so those are the things we learned. Now, the Texas legislature, do you want me to go on there? The Texas legislature addressed one of those concerns, and that is winterization.
Well, okay. Actually, before you go there, maybe break down for those who aren't familiar, who's in charge of ERCOT, who is monitoring, and who's supposed to be doing stuff, so people kind of understand, because you're kind of an expert. For those who don't know, it is a little confusing on who has what role here.
Well, supposedly, ERCOT is staffed by experts on power grids, okay, and I'm sure they are. But these experts on power grids for the past 20 years or however long ERCOT has existed have consistently overestimated how much wind can really supply into the system. We spent $7 billion, if everyone remembers, on power lines to bring this wind power that we were supposedly going to get from West Texas to the Houston and Dallas markets, right? $7 billion. The original cost estimate from the wind industry, that it was going to cost, the CREZ lines is what they're called. They were going to cost $1 billion. 10 years later, they ended up costing $7 billion. But they're there, and they're supposedly going to bring all that power in from West Texas, and they do sometimes. I guess when the wind and weather situation is perfect, then wind does supply even as much as 30% of our electricity in the state on a few days every year, and they brag about it, and ERCOT advertises it and yells and screams. But when you really need it, when it's really hot in August, when the high pressure dome sits over the North Texas like it does pretty much every year in August, the wind stops blowing in West Texas. And so it's kind of useless to us. So we get 2 or 3 megawatts on those days out of wind. And what that means is, I'm sorry, let's go back to ERCOT. So, sorry. ERCOT reports into the Public Utility Commission, supposedly. So the PUC is supposed to be responsible for what happens at ERCOT. ERCOT manages the grid. These electricity experts manage the grid, quote. And that means they're kind of responsible for, when you have a week in June where you had 12 megawatts of power offline for maintenance, and then you had Comanche Peak, one of their trains failed because they had a fire in a transformer, and 3 other plants went offline unexpectedly, and suddenly you had this lack of capacity. ERCOT's responsible for that. And the way they do it is they look and see, okay, this plant have applied to be offline for maintenance on these days. They look at their computer models. It says, how much can we expect to get out of wind and other generating sources on those days? And that's, they approve those plants to be offline based on those expectations. So, the PUC supposedly has oversight, but, one of the reasons all 3 PUC commissioners resigned in the wake of the February event was because PUC was not properly exercising its oversight. And I mean, we should all be honest about that. It's also, the mismanagement of the grid is also why half the board at ERCOT resigned in the wake of that freeze event, and why the CEO, who was asked by the governor to resign and refused, was fired. So nobody was doing their jobs, and we all need to admit that. So that's the other thing we learned in February.
The only person I heard point this out, and I'm gonna get it wrong, but I'll set it up for you here. Before the Texas freeze, they talked about the potential for like what was it, a minute or something? I remember you talking about this. Like they actually addressed the issue before the freeze happened.
Seconds.
How long?
42 seconds. They
42
had a
seconds.
three-hour board meeting on Wednesday. That would have been the 10th, I think, of February. Valentine's Day was Sunday, the 14th. So Wednesday would have been the 9th, I guess. And 10, 11, 12. No, Wednesday was the 9th. So they had a 3-hour board meeting. They spent 42 seconds of a 3-hour board meeting at ERCOT talking about emergency preparedness. That's not an exaggeration. It's absolutely what happened in that meeting. And that was we had 3 different winter fronts blow in starting on the 10th. I mean, it was the day before the first front blew in, and they knew these fronts were coming. And they still chose to spend 42 seconds talking about emergency preparedness. So I guess, all you can derive from that is that the quote experts at ERCOT felt like, boy, they had this in the bag. It was not going to be a problem. Well, it was a problem.
So your answer there was about 44 seconds long. So that's perspective.
Yeah, sorry.
Perspective of how long they talked about it in that meeting, which is astonishing because me and you have been in a lot of meetings in our careers, and for something to talk about for 42 seconds, it means it is a literal non-issue because I probably have droned on too long in meetings on stuff that didn't matter. I beat the dead horse by a time or two myself for hours on end, it feels like. So 42 seconds in a meeting is nothing.
I'll give you an analogy on this for people who aren't really familiar with the oil and gas business. If you go out and visit an offshore platform, like I've made several trips out to the offshore. I was, one of the ones I really remember the most was to Shell's Mars platform out in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. Every morning, every employee working on those sites, and this is true across the industry, they have an hour-long safety meeting every morning, and they talk about safety and emergency preparedness because they're so focused on preventing any accidents on these facilities. And the onshore sites are the same way. It may not last for an hour, but they go over the same stuff over and over and over again because they know that repetition is important. And so contrast that to the people supposedly managing our power grid spending 42 seconds of a 3-hour meeting on the same kinds of subjects. It's crazy.
It's crazy. And the other thing is, it's not as if, and this is something to bring up, it's not as if they spent 3 hours and they tried their best and they were wrong. That's in American society, we have kind of negated the fact that people are just wrong, even with their best effort, and we're too hard for that. That's not what happened. There was a lack of effort, a lack of foresight. And for that, they should be held accountable. And so you've kind of gone through kind of the levels of who they report to. But I know you're a little bit frustrated with the executive branch in Texas and kind of how they've responded.
Well, let's go on up through the chain. So the Public Utility Commission consists of 3 commissioners, just like the Railroad Commission. But the Railroad Commissioners are elected. They're statewide elected officials. The 3 public utility commissioners are appointees, and they're appointed by the governor of Texas. Since 1994, when George W. Bush defeated Ann Richards, every governor of Texas has been a Republican. Okay, I'm a lifelong Republican. So when I talk about this, you're listening to a guy who has voted for Greg Abbott every time he has run for office. Okay, so it's not that I hate Greg Abbott and don't like Republicans. I'm a Republican myself, so you can blame me for this too. But yes, I'm very frustrated with the governor right now because on February 24th, in the wake of that horrible event in which 200 Texans lost their lives and 10 million Texans were left without power, and a bunch of water systems around the state that had lost power were still down, and people were boiling water to take showers and drink, the governor got on television, statewide televised address, and he talked about what an epic failure this was on, and blamed ERCOT for a lot of it, and promised, at the end of that speech that he would call the legislature into special sessions if the legislature failed to deal with all the problems that he had talked about in that speech. And if you go back and read the text of the speech, the governor himself, the governor, admitted that we have a lack of reliable baseload capacity on this system. The governor admitted there was severe mismanagement at ERCOT. The governor talked about need to weatherize all of these facilities, the power plants, the wind turbines, all these natural gas pipeline and oil field facilities. Not the whole industry, but about 20% of it's relevant to the power grid. Okay. He promised us he would do that. And if you've been listening to what he said over the past few weeks, now, what he's been doing is just trying to say, oh, well, legislature fixed it all. Well, the legislature didn't fix it all. I would argue, frankly, that the legislature really did not fix any one of those three major aspects with the grid. And, they changed the way ERCOT people are selected. They changed, they created a communications committee to make sure that the natural gas infrastructure is all identified as critical infrastructure like hospitals are. And the other thing they did in Senate Bill 3 was say, okay, all you plants got to winterize, and all the relevant equipment on the grid has to be winterized. But what they did was then say, okay, PUC, you're going to write the regulations requiring the winterization. And what I would argue is that the PUC has been so dominated over the past decade, because we had a very similar event in 2011, and the exact same thing happened. The legislature did not take action to actually, by statute, mandate the weatherization and left it up to the PUC. And the PUC is historically very dominated by power generators, big corporate power generators, and other interests on the grid who don't want anything to change and don't want to invest the capital dollars, and it's very expensive, to winterize their facilities. And so I think the very predictable outcome of this regulatory exercise that the PUC is going to go through is that they're going to write regulations kind of like they did in 2011 that don't really have any teeth. And we're still not going to get Texas consumers and people living here are still not going to get the protection they need on the grid to keep it stable during these major weather events. So I'm very frustrated with the governor about this. He needs to call a special session. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has an op-ed in the Morning News, Dallas Morning News, today, the day we're recording this, saying the governor needs to call a special session on the grid and listing these exact issues, okay, that I've been talking about for 4 months in my columns. And he's not doing that just for fun, okay? He's doing that because he recognizes the legislature didn't do its job in the regular session.
Okay, so go back to something you said a minute ago. I used to be a member of the Republican Party. I'm now a Libertarian Party.
Yeah, well,
there's a lot of reasons for that. And I always say this, and people are like, so you believe, like, okay, not all libertarians believe the same thing. But part of my frustration with the conservatives, Republicans, if you were, was it seemed like, and I'm not talking about you, David, specifically, I'm talking about the politicals, that they didn't actually believe a lot of what they espoused. And so that kind of got me frustrated with the party and part of the reason I left. But anyways, one of the things yes, I know. One of the things that I've been saying, and this is the libertarian side of me coming out, that's why I preface this way, is that until these power companies are responsible to the end user, it's going to be hard to get change. Now, and when I hear you talk about this, you're saying, well, the governor appoints these people who are in charge of ERCOT, which means that they're not responsible to me and you. And so
that's right.
I'm also not saying that we should overnight change everything to the report to the end user, because that would be a problematic as well. But what is a reasonable step to where someone can be held accountable? Because right now you have Abbott, who, what's he up in 2022 or 2024? What's he up again?
Next year, every statewide elected official.
So you have him up in 2022. You might can get him somewhat accountable, but if he loses, then whoever comes in will appoint new people. So they're not really being held accountable in the same way. I mean,
Right.
But so what are some solutions to where people who did lose, it's not only people, we had people that lost their lives, which is the worst in the spectrum, but you have a lot of home damage and insurance
Oh
costs
my
and all
God.
this stuff that will last for months and months and months or years ahead. And there's no real way, no real outlet for people to say, okay, we're going to hold these politicians, except for they have to vote on this issue next year. And there's a lot of issues that will come up between now and next year. So give me some potential solutions. Is it just that the government upholds his word, or how do we prevent this in the future? Because I hear what
Well,
you're saying, and I agree that we should maybe do some stuff legislatively. But at the end of the day, we go back to the same problem, which is these appointed officials. You can't hold them accountable.
well, I think but I would argue that they were held accountable. I mean, they all resigned. Everybody on the PUC resigned. The governor was going to fire them all if they didn't resign. So they've all been replaced. That's how you hold politicians, and public officials accountable. At ERCOT, half the board resigned. A lot of them were just because they were from out of state. I think a lot of people were shocked to learn that we had this entity, which is a weird entity to begin
Mhm,
with. It's a
mhm,
501c4 organization, this, kind of private. I mean, what are we doing having a private entity like that managing our power grid? Why isn't it a state agency doing that? I mean, I have a problem with the whole structure of ERCOT to begin with. Not that I'm a big believer in big government,
sure.
but this is the public's grid. Okay, this is the grid that is over 80% of the state of Texas,
Mhm,
and the public's grid ought to be directly accountable to the public, and that means it should be state officials. So yeah, I have a concern that ERCOT is this step removed from that line of accountability. But Bill Magnus, the CEO, was fired, so he was held accountable. Who wasn't held accountable? Well, the lobbyists for all these entities on the grid, are not ever going to be held accountable for the stuff they tell
mhm,
to members of the
right.
legislature. And I was in the lobby for the oil and gas industry in 2011 in the wake of that event, and went to a lot of the hearings and went to a lot of the PUC hearings and saw the kind of nonsense that some of these interests in the
Mm,
grid were telling members of the legislature and the PUC, and utter complete nonsense just to, try to prevent any change in the system that is failing us more and more every year. Okay, so those people will not be held accountable. The legislators can only be held accountable by the voters. Now, Senate Bill 3 was a good bill when it came out of the Senate, and it was a bipartisan bill that was passed overwhelmingly in the Senate. There were very few people against that bill. And it had provisions, very effective, strong provisions that would have mandated the building of additional baseload capacity on the grid rather than leaving it up to this system that has failed us so miserably for the last decade. That was all stripped out in the dark of night by the members of the House State Affairs Committee, chaired by Chris Patty, a Republican from Marshall. Uh, Dead of night, all that stuff came out of it. That's so the committee's version went to the floor and it was passed. It was stripped out, stripped down version. And the Senate, having only 24 hours left in the session, had a choice between either passing the House version again or just letting the whole thing die, right? So they voted in favor of the House version, as they should have, because there are a few good things in Senate Bill 3. And so those people on that committee that stripped out that language that would have really been very helpful to improve the situation in the grid, they're not going to be held accountable. And anyone who's been engaged in the Texas lobby, I was part of the Texas lobby for 20 years, you know, you can imagine the kinds of pressures that those members of the legislature were being put under from certain interests on the power grid that led to that action in the dead of night.
right.
Um, so none of those people are going to be held accountable either. And I honestly, I don't know of any easy way to do that other than for the management at these big corporations to suddenly, find Jesus and hire people who are willing to deal with the legislature and the PUC honestly.
You leave us with such hope.
Yeah.
Okay, let's anything else on that before we move on to oil and gas stuff?
Yeah, let me just say that the governor has it in his power to fix all this. And he should keep his promise that he made on February 24th. And anyone who watches this ought to call his office and demand he do so. The lieutenant governor now is demanding it. I think you're going to see a growing chorus along those lines in the weeks to come as Republicans running for reelection wake up to the reality that this is their grid. There are no Democrat fingerprints on the Texas grid. This is all a Republican deal. So if we have another major disaster between now and next election day, all the fingers are going to get pointed at these Republicans because they had a chance to deal with all this and they didn't do it.
Any chance Abbott doesn't run and goes for president? Or do you think he would run and still go president? No? Well, let me tell you what.
Yeah, I hear that. But look, he's so far behind Ron DeSantis. I mean, look, he had a chance. The governor had an opportunity to be really decisive and really aggressive during the whole COVID thing.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron DeSantis was a month ahead of him every step of the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ron DeSantis is the obvious potential nominee for the Republicans in 2024 because I don't think Trump's going to run.
I don't either.
And, Abbott has no chance. So he'd be wasting his time. I hope he doesn't do that. He's been overall not a bad governor,
Mm-hmm.
And I would vote for him again, unless the grid falls apart between now and then. I may have to vote for a damn libertarian.
Hey, whoa. I'm about to say, I can't get your vote. What's it going to take to get your vote, David? Come on now.
Well, so I'd be a libertarian too if I thought they could ever win anything. But, the problem with libertarians, let's just take 10 seconds on this.
Yeah.
The problem with libertarians is their whole line is telling people what they can't do for them, what government can't do for them. And that's not how you get elected in this country. So,
no, I agree. And I think what you're seeing now, at least in the Mises caucus, the Libertarian, is there is an acknowledgement that they have to reframe some of the issues. So like I said a minute ago, whatever my solution to just about any major problem, I would not implement it overnight because that's disastrous.
Right.
And so you're starting to see libertarians who are trying to be thoughtful and saying, okay, well, we really want to end up over here, but we need to go there. And if you follow the Democrats and the progressives, they're very good about that. Like they want this object that's way away, and then they just slowly, boom, boom, boom. And you wake up one day and go, oh my gosh, like they've made a lot of ground on us over here, And so libertarians, if they would ever figure out how to do stuff. And the final thing is libertarians, and I think they're focused on this, should focus on the small local elections where they can actually look at some of their policies and test some of that stuff out. So,
and stop running crazy people for president.
Well,
that would be a good start.
Yes, that's a yes.
Like yes, Gary Johnson.
Yes, Gary Johnson. Yeah, Bill. Well, yeah. That's agreed. Listen, we've got our own problems. Okay, like I always say, the worst of the Republicans and the Democrats, it's also the Libertarians. So we're not immune from that either. Okay, let's talk about oil and gas. I don't have the prices pulled up, but I think WTI is about 73 last time.
Yeah, it was up this morning. It was up over 73 again.
Yeah, so it's 73. Natural gas is $3.78, which is basically, I mean, like that's like $100 oil. It's crazy to see it up like that. What are your thoughts on the prices? I know there's a big debate about how much storage we actually have for oil, and the prices are being overly impacted by inflation. U.S. production will never catch up. Ellen and I had a story yesterday we covered. It's from the Dallas Fed survey that said that this is from a CEO of a local operator, said that 1 out of every 400 banks is only willing to offer fresh capital. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. What's going on with prices, the U.S. industry, wherever you want to start at, we'll go from.
Well, so I think what everyone needs to understand about oil is there's two things. Number one, the price is being propped up by the OPEC Plus agreement, which is keeping currently about 5.5 million barrels of potential supply off of the market in order to prop up the price. Okay. And as long as OPEC Plus does that, then the pressures on the price overall globally are going to be for it to keep going up. And Goldman Sachs, looking at that situation, thinks it's going to be $80 by the end of summer. I think they're probably right. And then, now you've got Bank of America and others saying we're going to have $100 oil next year. So that's in the near term. And it's all driven by the fact that global demand is recovering much more rapidly than anyone predicted from the COVID pandemic. Well, anyone but me predicted. I've been saying that would happen since last October. Okay, I'm not the only one, but a small number have been trying to tell everybody that would be the case. And so that's in the near term. So over the next year and a half, as long as OPEC Plus holds together, oil prices are going to go up, and gasoline prices will go up with them, of course. Then when you look at years beyond 2022, the other thing everyone needs to understand is we have had a structural, enormous underinvestment in the discovery and production of new oil reserves around the world. One estimate I saw, I think it was Rystad Energy, estimated that this underinvestment totals up to about $350 billion in lack of investment since 2014, since the first big price bust hit in 2014. So what that means is the finding of new reserve and producing capacity has not kept up with the pace of rising demand globally over that period of years, and it's a very big deficit that can't be made up in anything less than a decade. And at the same time as all that's been happening, you've had all these pressures from the radical environmental community and now the Biden administration and other global governments to depress investment in oil and gas. And ESG investors are also a part of that, and depress, investment in the finding of new reserves. What that's going to mean starting in 2023, and won't matter what OPEC Plus does by then, unless we have another pandemic. Starting in 23, I mean, we may have $150, $200 oil, because you're going to have a structural deficit in supply. And so the price is going to go way up. And that's almost just baked into the cake at this point. And all these, what I want your viewers to remember is that you and I told them this here on June 29th, 2021. And 2 years from now, what they need to look at, the people they need to look at, is the ESG investor community and the radical environmentalists who started promising you 10 years ago that, electric vehicles and wind and solar can make up for all that. Well, they can't. Okay. They can't. And they won't be able to do that in 2023. They won't be able to do it in 2033 or 2043. And we're going to need oil for a long, long time. And people need to figure that out. Unfortunately, the public is so ignorant about all of this and so propagandized by our news media and education system that you won't figure it out until there's a major crisis, and then it's too late. Well, we're going to have a major crisis, I would say probably around 2024, 2025, when we're just not going to have enough oil to go around. And that's because of what's been happening since 24, not been happening since 2024, and all the lies you've been told by the climate change alarmists. And so bookmark this and refer back to it in a couple of years.
We're going to clip it. We're going to put it out there for everyone. Okay. Yeah. Let's unpack a few things there. Let's go back to the OPEC Plus. So my understanding is, I think OPEC Plus, to your point, the prices are high because they have about an extra 3-4 million barrels of spare capacity they could put on the market right now that they haven't put on.
5.5 is what they claim.
Okay, 5.5. Right? Yeah, depending on who you believe, but yeah. 3 to 4, 5.5, maybe. I think the official number is like upwards of 6, but I don't know. We'll see. 4 to 6, we'll call it. If I were them, I'm curious your thoughts on that. If I were them, if I were advising them right now, I take what you said about 2023 off the side for a second. Would it be a shrewd move right now, as prices are climbing up, to dump that 4 to 6 million barrels on the market, put the price back down, and really, really put I don't want to say death blow to the shale industry, but really a kick to the knee, because you're going to see, as prices go up, there will be dollars coming back to the industry. But if you had a sudden price collapse again, what would it do to the industry, and could we see OPEC Plus do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, they could try that. They've done it twice. They did it in 2014. They did it again last March. Um, they could do that at any time, and that's I've written about that many times. You in the shale business,
Hmm.
and producers in this country have been remarkably disciplined this year and
They have,
not over drilling.
right?
Okay, but you still have this business model in the shale business that is wholly reliant on the OPEC plus deal holding together in order to be profitable. You do. I talked to a CEO last week who says, well, he's creating this new kind of company, and I won't say who it is, and creating this new business model that's going to be profitable. And yeah, it's going to be profitable as long as OPEC plus holds together and as long as prices are above $50. But if OPEC plus falls apart, price goes back down to 30. Nobody's profitable. I don't care what they say. So yeah, it's a dangerous situation, and OPEC plus could do it to us anytime. You know, they have competing priorities though. They all these countries really need this revenue and they need these stronger prices. And the Saudis are no exception. The Saudis may need higher prices more than anyone, considering the size of their social welfare state. And uh, it's just this constant thing. Every month they meet, they're meeting this week, and everybody's eyes are turned to them. What are they going to do? Um, but as long as they hold it together, everybody's okay.
I've been saying since December, I thought this was the best thing that OPEC could have done, which was meet every month because you put a pressure on U.S. investment going to shale because you're like, okay, well, dang, OPEC's meeting in a month. I mean, obviously they could have had special meetings at any point in the past they wanted to,
Yeah.
but they had the two big meetings. But now it's like, well, okay, what's OPEC going to do in a month? And a few tweets or a few press releases 15 days out. You constantly keep this pressure where
Yeah.
U.S. investors are looking at OPEC going, oof, do we want to invest in Shell? Because at any moment they could change their mind. And of course, they go and they have the drama. The Russians are
Right.
mad and the Iranians are mad. And so I think it's been a really shrewd move, regardless if they put the extra barrels on, just from the outside perspective, going, dang, they're meeting again.
Yep.
So,
Exactly. It
um,
gives them a lot of power because I mean, every time the Russian minister last week said, well, we kind of like to raise our own production in Russia above our quotas, and the market dropped, 50 cents just within a few minutes of him saying that. So it's like Elon Musk talking about Dogecoin. Every time he says something, Dogecoin
right.
goes up or
Oh,
down,
yeah.
and so anyway,
So you
gives them a
mentioned,
lot of power.
yeah, you mentioned people needing higher prices. Okay, so let's talk about that because I think that gets missed. You look at like Nigeria, they need like I think their break even is like 140. It's something
Right.
crazy, so there is an incentive to let the price go higher as the other side of the spectrum. What are your thoughts on? Let's take two things. One, Venezuela and Iran, who have been their oil industry has not been what it was historically. Can they get back? I know the Biden administration and the Canadians and the EU sent some kind of note saying that there is a pathway for Venezuela to come back to the market, not be the black market. We'll see what that means. I'm curious your thoughts on that. But two, Africa as a whole, I know there's a big push on as sub-Saharan Africa to kind of get their act together and to start
Yeah.
drilling and to maybe even join OPEC. So two separate issues, but they do impact some of these things that you're talking about as we move forward. What are your thoughts on them?
Sure, some of the biggest resources in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, and so those are places where there's potential to start making up this structural deficit that we have, and in offshore northern South America too, Guyana and Suriname. Um, but Venezuela. I mean, the big problem with Venezuela is it's run by a dictator, basically a despotic dictator who has run all the private companies out of there and has made his country a desert of investment. No one wants to do business with his government. So, I mean, as long as Maduro, the government is in power in Venezuela, its industry is going to be depressed and just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse. Um, um, who else did you ask about? I'm sorry. Sub-Saharan
Ron,
Africa.
Ron.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, those countries have always had governance issues and
Mhm.
problems, with revolutions constantly going on. You have a similar situation in Libya, and then Iran is just, the whole thing depends on reaching another nuclear deal with the Biden administration, which really wants to do it. For whatever reason, I really can't understand the almost religious fervor Biden and Obama had with doing these deals with Iran. But when they do, and whenever they get that completed, which they will, Iran can potentially put another 2 million barrels onto the market, and they will. I just, it's a mystery to me, and I don't understand all the geopolitics of that. But why our government cares whether or not Iran is able to export their oil is beyond my comprehension.
So yeah, let's talk about that, because one of the things, I don't know if we talked about this before, so I'm curious your thoughts. If you look at what China's doing in the Middle East, they are definitely they are going all in. It feels like, with the Saudis, the Iranian deal. At the same time, the U.S.'s foreign policy in the Middle East is very much, well, we're helping these guys and we're fighting these guys, and let's just set aside maybe what we think about that.
We're bombing these guys.
Yeah, we're bombing these guys. Is the Chinese strategy actually better in the Middle East, because they're pretty much like, whatever, we're going to work with whomever, and the U.S. is, we're going to work with you, we're going to bomb you, and we're not going to work with you, and we're going to support you. And then when you actually read between the lines, it's not exactly clear that we were right, we were right on some of those issues. But will the U.S. find itself in a position that, if we're not careful, we're going to alienate too many people in the Middle East?
Sure, of course. And yeah, the Chinese process is much better. China has the advantage. Yesterday, they were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party in China. Okay. And the Communist Party has been in power for over half a century now in China. And so China has the advantage of being able to engage in long-term planning on all of these things, and of being able to force its population to go along with whatever the plan is. Whereas in the United States, we change administrations every 4 to 8 years. And if you change parties when you do that, then you have a complete change in direction vis-a-vis Middle East policy. The Democrats hate Israel. The Republicans want to be Israel's ally. Saudi Arabia, Trump made fantastic, great inroads with Saudi Arabia that this administration is probably going to work to destroy, just like it's trying to destroy the Abraham Accords. Actual peace in the Middle East was President Trump's goal. And yes, I was a big fan of President Trump's policy towards the Middle East, because, his policies led to us not getting involved in all these wars and winding them down. Whereas the policies of this administration are going to go right back to winding them back up and creating more and more enemies in the Middle East, which is what the Obama and the Bush administrations did as well. So we had a 4-year respite on all of that, and peace was breaking out all over. And then we changed presidencies, and now the war machine's back in power, and we're bombing Syria, the border between Syria and Iran. We're bombing some faction of rebels that nobody even knows who they are, for reasons that nobody can really explain. So I hate this policy. I hate the United States being constantly in armed conflicts in the Middle East and engaged in those conflicts. And so the irony of that bombing run, by the way, is that supposedly the rebels we were bombing were aligned with Iran. The country, the Biden administration, by the way, is trying to negotiate a nuclear arms agreement with. Now think about that. What kind of sense does any of that make? It's insanity.
Yeah.
And the United States has been responsible for an incredible amount of conflict and death in the Middle East. And, we need to stop doing that at some point.
Yeah. I don't want to devolve into all of the.
Yeah,
I'm
sorry.
No. I didn't bother me any. I don't want to put you in a bad spot. But they're so complicated to follow. But one of the things I'd point out to people was, because it was an easy thing to show. During Trump's State of the Union, he had a widow from a Navy SEAL there, and her husband died in Yemen. And what I would just ask people, I'd say, what are we doing in Yemen?
You got me, man.
Right? And everyone goes, well, we're doing something. I was like, I'm just saying, the State of the Union, President Trump, I'm not trying to disparage the man. I'm not trying to say anything. I'm just using this as an analogy to say, before we start saying we're continuing these wars, or we're pro-bombing or whatever, explain to me why we have a Navy SEAL losing his life in Yemen. And if you can explain it to me, we can have a conversation. But if you can't, then let's back off all of the bomb talk, because.
And no one can explain it to you.
No one can. You start to think about it. It's really weird. It's really sad. Here's a man who gave up his life, and the Yemen people. So, but it just illustrates the point very well. And I'm not trying to pick on Trump or Biden or anything. It's just an easy illustration to go. We can't even explain why this man died in a country that we're not even fighting the people of Yemen. We're helping the Saudis. We were. So, anyways, it's a convoluted mess, and it is sad. And it is frustrating. Let's get back to oil. What are your thoughts on the Biden administration? How much impact has the permit ban, or whatever you want to call it, on the federal leases? How much has that actually had on the oil and gas industry versus perception? Will they overturn it in time if it hasn't had an impact? What's your read on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's had any real impact other than maybe moving a few drilling rigs out of New Mexico to West Texas to drill for oil in the Permian Basin. Yet,
Mm-hmm.
if it becomes a 4-year deal, well, then that's going to have an impact. And because companies did stock up on leases during the last 2 years of the Trump administration. So, there's a lot of drilling, a lot of potential drilling they can do. To me, what's more important is what the administration is going to do administratively, because there's all kinds of ways they can slow up the permitting process.
Yeah.
And all these wells have to be permitted, right? You have to get a permit from the BLM to drill on federal lands. And if it starts taking a year to get that permit instead of a month, well, then that's going to be a very significant impact on a lot of.
And they talked about raising the royalty as well, I believe, right?
Yeah, they want to raise the royalty. I have to be honest with you, though. I think, look, 12.5% royalty is what it is on most federal lands onshore.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few where it's 16.67. Well, that was established way back in the 80s, okay, when the average royalty rate on fee lands, right, on your ranch or whatever, was also 12.5%. Well, now the prevailing royalty rate on private lands is 25%, and it's even higher than that in some instances. So why should the federal government still be stuck collecting 12.5% based on a royalty rate that's half a century old? So I don't really, as a philosophical matter, have a problem with raising the royalty rate. Will that discourage drilling on federal lands to some extent? Probably.
Maybe
but
so.
if the resource is good enough, it won't. You'll still be able to be profitable.
Right. Yeah. That would be my point as well, is that whether or not they should raise or not, it just might have an impact, because some of the land they were drilling potentially could have been drilled because you're getting that reduction in the royalty, and they're like, it's not really worth it. So,
and I'm not making any friends anywhere in this interview, am I?
You're making friends. Me and you, we're agreeing all the time. I don't know.
I'm gonna have all the oil and gas people mad at me too now.
Well, Dave, but see, here's the thing, and this is part of the reason I like this show, is because we get to talk about principles. Right. And one of the things that I always tell, when you talk about, people talk to me about the China stuff, because the Bush-China Foundation, and they'll say, oh my gosh, China's doing this, and we got to respond this way. I'm like, hold on. Do you believe that communism works? Because if you do, then let's just go whole hog in. Because, and I kind of use that analogy just to kind of set the conversation, because we look at things, and to your point about the raising the royalty, if it's a fair market rate, and you believe that the government should own land and collect a royalty, then there's no reason the government shouldn't get a fair market rate for the royalty. Like that's a principle that, if me and you might disagree on the federal land or whatever, but the logic is sound there. It's not a talking point. And that's something we have to get back to in this country, is what are our principles?
Yeah.
What do we actually believe? Because so often we get tugged right or left because we don't actually have a principle. We're just like, oh, well, Biden said this, and therefore I'm a liberal, and so I go with Biden. Or Trump said this, I'm a Republican. And it's, what do you actually believe? And so I don't have a problem with arguing principles over people, because at least then it's a consistent thing that you're going to hold from administration to administration. And we've really lost that in this country.
We have. Yes, we certainly have.
But anyways, to your point, they could add more paperwork, make the process more more onerous. But what about the incentivization that we were hearing from the oil and gas industry in the U.S. that they're having a hard time getting money? What's your real infrastructure bill? Will that impact oil and gas companies' ability to get money, because money will be going towards these large infrastructure projects? And generally, what is your read on the bill as it sits right now?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly won't help the oil and gas industry. It's a big part of it is big giveaways to wind and solar again. Even more subsidies for wind, solar, and electric vehicles because they're not competitive in the marketplace despite all of the propaganda you see. Um, so, I mean, to that extent, and it would, offer preferences for investment in those industries, and because that's what this administration is trying to incent. And so, as just a matter of principle, I mean, we have used the tax code in this country for well over a century to incent the priorities of the federal government, and that's this administration's priority. So, the infrastructure bill, there's nothing in it for the oil and gas business, nothing that's going to, help in any way, and a lot that'll hurt. And that's the way it is. I mean, elections have consequences.
What about the bill? Is there parts of the bill that you do like? I know you have been in favor historically of
No.
raising the gas tax. No,
Oh, is it the gas tax in there?
no, no,
Raising
no,
the
no,
gas
no, no,
tax
no, no. I
on
was
it?
just saying, like, I know, no, I was just gonna say that I know that historically you have been in favor of some infrastructure bills, like raising the gas tax or repairing bridges, obviously stuff like that. So I just didn't know if it had some elements that you've seen
I
that you,
mean,
because it.
I'll be honest with you. I think it's a travesty, and it's going to be an even bigger travesty because a bunch of Republicans are going to vote for it, knowingly knowing that it only gets passed if the overall budget gets passed through the reconciliation process, and that's another $6 trillion. By the way, it just filled with all of the Democrats'
Mhm.
left wing priorities. So no, I don't like a word in that bill, and I think it should be soundly rejected by anybody with a functioning synapses in their cranium.
Well,
But
you're talking about people in DC. Come on, David. Don't
yeah,
don't don't expect too much. How long do you think the Biden administration has to get this bill done before midterm jitters may
yeah,
get people to shy away?
I think they got until September. It's just like the first year of the Obama administration. They had to get Obamacare done by September. By the time any of these members of Congress go back for an extended break and have to be bombarded by their constituencies for all the insane things they're doing in Washington. So whatever doesn't get passed, I assume they're going to take an August break. Um, so whatever doesn't get passed before then is not going to pass. And I think if the budget bill, this omnibus $6 trillion bill, they want to ram through on a 50-person vote in the Senate, isn't passed before they go back for August recess, then it's not going to pass because, for the simple reason that Kirsten Sinema, the senator from Arizona, and Joe Manchin, the Democrat senator from West Virginia, are going to go back to their states and get bombarded by their constituencies but for all the stupid things they're doing. So you lose two Democrat votes, you got to pick up two Republicans somewhere, and there's Mitt Romney, but whoever that second Republican is still kind of up in the air. So I think they got a big problem if they don't get it done by August.
I love how you just casually throw out, "Oh, there's Mitt Romney."
Well, Mitt Romney's a
Oh,
Democrat. I mean, let's be
I
honest.
know, I know. It's just
Yeah.
well said. Most people don't appreciate that. I was on a conversation, I don't know, a few months ago, and someone's like, I like Mitt Romney. He really plays it down the middle. I'm like, yeah, okay.
Okay. Good.
Okay. So, okay, Mr. Blackman, I think we've kept you long enough. This has been enjoyable as
Oh man,
always.
I'm just getting started here. Who haven't I made mad yet? Okay.
Well, you've got the libertarians, you got the governor,
Yeah.
Democrats,
Republicans. I got
foreign policy
Democrats.
guys, the military. Oh,
Oil
you're
and
talking a
gas
lobby, the
guys. The
military
gun
industrial
guys.
complex. That's a lobby there. Uh,
Woo. Yeah,
you
that's
got a lot.
right. I even got the military industrial complex. That's awesome.
Oh, okay. So shalemag.com is where we'll link to in the show notes. And you guys put out a lot of stuff. Why don't you maybe just real quick for people who aren't familiar with Shell Mag, and I'll link to your Forbes piece with that you
Yeah.
published, I believe today or yesterday about the lieutenant governor. But Shell Mag, what are you guys putting out there?
Oh gosh, we just we it's a bi-monthly magazine. We have an active blog. The website changes every day. There's new content. I mean, we cover the whole oil and gas industry, and I think we do a better job of it every month. And it's really an outstanding publication, and I'm not taking credit for that. I'm quote the editor.
Mhm.
but I really don't have all that much to do with the quality of the product. And I just think it's an excellent source of information for anyone who's interested in the oil and gas business.
And I owe you a congratulations. I don't think I've talked. I just realized pulling up the website here. You're on a syndicated talk show now.
Yeah,
Congratulations on that.
our
I
radio
saw the news.
program.
I talked
I'm
to you about
sorry,
that.
I should have mentioned that. In the Oil Patch Radio Show is a once weekly, hour long radio program that we also podcast, and now it's part of the Salem Radio Network, and it's being picked up nationally by affiliates. There's I think 3,500 affiliates. I mean, obviously they're not all picking it up, but
Sure.
more and more every week. And we've been statewide for 3 years and in Texas. So now we're going kind of going nationally and increasing that footprint. And I'm as bombastic on that show as I was here today.
I'll give a little background before I let you go here. David and I were actually hosting a podcast together, and we got about 3 episodes in, and someone sent David a letter, said, "No, it's too much. It's too much.
No, my clients, yeah.
These two guys can only come together every so often. It's too much."
And that was so much fun too. I regret that, but oh well.
No, it was fun, but I'm glad to see that your show has taken off, and I guess I hadn't spoken to you since I saw that. It's been a few months ago since that news came out.
About 6 weeks ago.
6 weeks ago?
And
Okay.
it's a big deal for us. And,
Yes, it's a great deal. It's awesome.
it's really helping with advertisers and things like that. So it's
Awesome.
good.
Well, David, thank you again. We'll link to all of this in the show notes for the listeners, and hopefully get you on again in the future.
Absolutely, man. Have a good week.
Thanks again, David, for coming on. Always enjoy having you. And now for my recommendation, which is the book, The Dragon's Gift. The Dragon's Gift. If you're trying to understand China's aid to Africa and how it all works, how it all ties together, this book does a great job of dispelling the myths, talking about what's going on. Also, you can go listen to Inside the War Room episode. I don't know what it was, but Eric Olander talks about this as well. We'll link to that in the show notes. You can find all this in the show notes or at ryanswarroom.com, ryanswarroom.com. We'll talk to you next time.